Hi, and welcome to this edition of The Life of Purpose. We are starting to look at the very last book of the Bible, the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ, and we welcome you to this journey. Bill Brunson and I have been working together a long time, and this is one of our favorite books.
Absolutely.
But for most pastors, it doesn't get preached on very often.
No, it does not.
It takes many years, if it ever does, get preached on.
Right. You have to be in your church, in your place of ministry, usually for quite a while before you take on the book of Revelation. Even though pretty much from like week one of arriving in a church, you'll have members of the congregation say, are you going to do a Bible study on Revelation? Are you going to do a sermon series on Revelation? And every time my response is no. But eventually, you really need to, as a pastor, you need to go through Revelation for your own study, like we both like to do, but also to share that with the congregation, because there's just, Revelation has taken on this second nature, and there's all of this anxiety and, I don't know, seems like there's a world of secrecy surrounding Revelation.
It's odd that we study every other book of the Bible with certain kind of rules.
Right.
Certain strategies. So how does this relate? If it's a New Testament book, how does this relate to the Old Testament? Mm-hmm. What images are found in the Old Testament? If it's a New Testament book, how does it relate to other books that were written in the New Testament or in the Old Testament? And so we are always sort of looking at context. We're trying to understand from Scripture how to interpret Scripture.
Yeah.
And then we get to the book of the Revelation, and it's like, no rules.
No rules at all.
It has nothing to do with anything from the past.
No.
It must have something to do with whatever political figure has come on the stage in the last month.
It's like there is a gap. But we know between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have a gap of history that expands there. But it's like there's this great theological and gap between Jude and Revelation. It's like you read all of these the exact same way. You read the story along and everything's going well. And then it's like, okay, now we go down into the layer. And in the layer, we shall break open the book of Revelation. And we'll read it in a whole different way, looking at it through a whole different lens, because it's the Revelation.
And it lends itself to sort of feel like that's appropriate. I mean,
right.
It has lots of lists of things. And it loves numbers. And there's series of sevens of churches and seals and bowls.
Right.
And so you can, and the writer likes to use a certain pattern. So with the Revelation, you have things that God's pleased with, things that God is not pleased with, a special message for them. And so you can sort of start making charts almost and spreadsheets and really the charts are they're not bad because there really are patterns there, but you can get to the point where you kind of go overboard with charts too. What's that, Bill?
Well, it's not charts. No, it's not. We won't really look at this. We won't. I mean, I spend a long time on them, and
yeah. Well, sometimes those charts can get out of control.
Yeah, I guess.
And suddenly there's walls of charts and cylinders full of charts.
They wouldn't have taken up all the walls. I just want to go on record as saying that most of the walls, just not all the walls.
And I don't really think that's what the Revelator was wanting to do.
No.
Though you can make a few. Certainly, there's certain patterns that evolve in how John writes it. So that's one reason why it's kind of hard to dive into, because people sort of remove all the rules. They see it as a very different type of literature, and so they're not really sure how to go about it. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that I find happens in the Revelation is that there's an assumption that it was written by John in the first century for my generation.
Right. John looked across the years and saw our exact moment in time.
And not just our particular year, but our particular country.
Right.
And so...
in a part of the world he didn't know existed.
Right. And so what's fascinating when you look at church history is this same sort of phenomenon happens in practically every generation in practically every country.
Yeah.
That there is an assumption that somehow the book of the Revelation was written about us for our moment in time. And so that makes it very difficult to help people, to try to get people to step back and say, wait a minute, you've suspended the normal rules for interpreting Scripture. I mean, nobody goes into Mark and tries to figure out who the living Satan is in the book of Mark, but we do it in the Revelation.
Right.
And so we've suspended the rules, and so it makes it a challenge often to preach from and a challenge to teach from. So kind of our approach is to not look at it as a different kind of book.
No.
We acknowledge that it is a different kind of literature, most definitely. It's apocalyptic literature, which is found only in the second half of Daniel and in the book of the Revelation. But the theology, the Old Testament connections, the really rootedness in the early church are identical to the rest of the Gospels, or really the rest of the New Testament, even more so, because it was the very last book written.
Absolutely.
And so this is the last sort of update that we have from the early church.
Yeah.
And so there's very little doubt about, or much less doubt about who wrote it or how it came about, because, well, later church theologians and early church theologians were alive when this was still very much a living document for them. So our approach is to kind of use what a normal approach to a typical book is, which is who, what, where, when, and why, and how.
Yeah.
So let's kind of look at those questions. So who wrote John?
John was, the Revelation was written by John. You gave it away.
I gave it away, yeah.
Right there.
Jeff
yeah, but Revelation's written by John. John, the son of Zebedee. John the Evangelist, as he became known. And we know some about John, of course, because we know John was born in and around Capernaum in the Galilee. He was born somewhere around between 10 and 15 A.D. He may have been the youngest, or at least one of the youngest, of the disciples. And that allowed him to live the span of time that he lived.
And unlike a lot of the other disciples, he did not meet an early death.
No.
Though there were lots of attempts to kill him.
I mean, his brother James dies around 44 A.D., and he's in Jerusalem and is killed. And it's around 44 A.D. that John leaves and goes to Ephesus and relocates to Ephesus. And so we know several pieces of history that are tied to John. And we know that he lives through so much of the establishment of the early church, because he lives through, well, the very first persecution the church experienced was when Nero came to the throne in 64 AD. And so when Nero becomes the emperor of Rome, then John is living in Ephesus, which is a province of Rome. And so he's dealing with this. But in 67 AD, just 3 years later, Peter is killed in Rome, is crucified upside down in Rome, and Paul is beheaded in Rome. And so John is in Ephesus when Peter, the one that he looked to as the leader of the disciples, and then Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, that helped to found the churches that John is now sort of a part of in Asia. Well, here they're both gone in 1 year. And then John is in Ephesus when he hears the news that Jerusalem has been sacked by the Romans. They're done with the Jewish people. They have pushed the temple literally off of Temple Mound. They shoved the blocks of the temple off of Temple Mound, and they build a temple to Jupiter on top of Temple Mound. And so he's watching all that happen from a distance. And then when Nero is gone, well, then Domitian takes the throne in 81 AD. And one of the early church fathers, Tertullian, recorded that John was thrown in a cauldron of boiling oil in Rome. He was taken to Rome from Ephesus and was thrown in a cauldron of boiling oil, which he survived miraculously. and he goes back to Ephesus. And then toward the end of Domitian's reign, in around 94 AD, Domitian sees him as a political threat because he has a lot of followers. And so Domitian has him exiled to the Isle of Patmos.
And that's mentioned very early in the first chapter of the book of Revelation.
That's where he is when he receives the revelation.
And he's there because he is being persecuted along with the rest of the Christian church,
right?
For their beliefs.
And he's there for 2 years, and it wasn't an easy life for him. He's there for 2 years, and you have to remember he was born around 10 to 15 A.D. We're in 96 A.D., so he is not a young man. And he is on the Isle of Patmos for 2 years, and then in 96 A.D., that's when Domitian dies. And so his political exiles are no longer exiled. And so John is able to return to Ephesus, and he dies in Ephesus somewhere between 98 and 100 A.D. And it's while he's there that he writes down the Revelation. And so this book, it is, as you said, it's the last word we get from one of the original disciples. And the one who sat next to Jesus at the Last Supper, the one who stood at the base of the cross and watched him die, the one who took Mary into his home and he became her son, she became his mother for the last years of her life. John writes this, and so when it came time to canonize the New Testament, put together the book as we know it, then Revelation was the easiest book. I mean, when you look at the history of the canonization process, it was the easiest book because early church fathers like Polycarp of Ephesus and Irenaeus of Antioch both were disciples of John in Ephesus. And both of them held Revelation as sacred text, having been written by John after Patmos. And then you get Papias and Origen and Justin Martyr, all in the first century, second century timeline. They all hold it as sacred text. And so there was, when it came time to put the New Testament together, there was really no opposition to Revelation being part of the text because it was from John, it was a message to the church from Jesus, and it was something that the church needed to hear.
So we've kind of looked at the who and the when and a little bit of the where of how the book came about. Mm-hmm. But I think probably the biggest difference is the how. He writes in a style of literature called apocalyptic literature, and it comes from the book. I mean, apocalypse means revelation, mm-hmm. And so really the whole genre of literature is named after this book,
right?
Because of, the first words of it are the revelation by Jesus Christ, and so it's a very common word. I love that though that we use the word apocalyptic to mean horrible things like
right.
The end of the world, but apocalypse just simply means what's being revealed. It doesn't have a scary meaning in Scripture.
Yeah, we refer to the apocalyptic storm that came through.
Right.
It was a few years ago we experienced what we all termed as snowpocalypse.
Right.
Because it suddenly snowed in a short span of time, a lot of snow for the South, and our world shut down. Well, that's not really. It wasn't the revelation of snow.
Right, and that's what it would mean in Greek is the revelation of snow. Well, that's not. That's not what's going on. But it was a form of literature that used a lot of images written in a very politically difficult time, mm-hmm. to try to say things in code in a way that most people would get, but the right people wouldn't get.
Yeah.
And so kind of like for those of us who live in the South of America, if we were to say something like, say that the Tigers came into T-Town and
their fans shouted to an eagle,
and it swooped down into the field, But
And
the
then-
elephant was not afraid.
Because there was a tide of crimson that was rolling.
We would know that it was football on Saturday.
Yeah. It was Iron Bowl day.
It was Iron Man. But that was not really, but a person 2,000 years from now, they might get half of those images.
Right.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not going to get all of the nuances of that. And so what makes it difficult with interpreting the Revelation is that we know a lot of the images because most of them come out of the Old Testament.
Yes.
But there are a few that we can't get. And so our goal in what we're doing in this series is not to get into the weeds of every single word and every single little piece, because if you do that, then you lose the grandeur of the big picture, which is this is the gospel. Mm-hmm. This is the good news that Jesus came into the world, created the church, and the church, though it is being persecuted, has a beautiful future, and that God owns that future. So there's a lot of reason for hope to keep travailing. If we get stuck in the weeds, we find ourselves looking at very different meanings.
Right.
And so, so when we look at this, we're not going to take off the normal rules of interpretation. We're going to be looking at how it looks at the Old Testament, what are the symbols that are there that we can understand, and we're going to admit that there's some pieces of this we're not going to just delve into because we're not sure exactly of all the images, and frankly, the people who claim to know all of the charts of the book of the Revelation usually are the ones that are the scariest ones to hear. So as we get forward, I look forward to hearing more about it and its meaning, and look forward to discovering what God has to say to us through this very ancient text.
Absolutely.